So this is evidence of the New Testament in Christ's resurrection. So we're kind of sticking with the New Testament for now. So when we say manuscripts, this was before the printing press. The printing press came around in the 1400s or so. Kind of wasn't popular until maybe the 1500s. But before that, Bibles were handwritten. So manuscript means a handwritten copy of the Bible. So all the Bibles before the 1500s were usually handwritten. So we're talking about when you hear the word manuscript, you're thinking a handwritten old Bible. Okay. So as far as how many of these we have, we've got 5,800 in Greek and 19,000 in other languages. So that's a lot. And these are all 99% the same. So some people say, well, the Bible was changed over time. Well, 99% of it wasn't. The other 1% were spelling and grammar errors. So when they copied it over, sometimes they'd misspell a word or have a grammatical typo. That almost all spelling and grammar issues. Only 1% of that 1% were things like commentary getting added into the text on accident, which sometimes a sentence would get added in, or a couple words would get added in somewhere. For example, I'll just give you an example. I'll give you two examples. In one case, in Matthew, you get the words, this kind only comes out by prayer and fasting. Most of you probably recognize which part that's from. The words "and fasting" weren't in, I believe it's Matthew, weren't in Matthew in the older manuscript. So they got added in somewhere. And what happens is they were added in from the parallel text. If you read that in, I believe it's paralleled in Luke, I want to say. But it has "and fasting" in the parallel to other gospel has it. So at some point somebody who copied Matthew added "and fasting" because they remembered it was in the other gospel that said that. So it got added into Matthew. It's not that it doesn't belong there. It's just Matthew didn't have it. The other gospel did have it. So somebody added it into Matthew at some point. There's another example in First John. His epistle has an extra sentence added in there that didn't make its way until I want to say it was the 600s in Latin, or 4, 5, 600s in Latin, not till the 1400s in the Greek. But by now they've weeded that stuff out. So really 99% is the same. 99% of the last remaining percent is spelling and grammar issues. And so 1% of 1% was little things like this, which we have easily weeded out over the last, especially the last 100 years. Our scholars have done a really great job. Most Bibles will have, asterisks and notes of this stuff. So you say, well, 5,800 over 1,500 years isn't, how impressive is that? Well, in the 2nd century, we have 12 copies of old Bibles. Not full Bibles, because the Bible wasn't canonized yet, but that would be partial Bibles. In the 3rd century, we have 64. That's a lot for a text that old. So the 3rd century is the 200s AD. That's a lot for that age of the text. And by the 4th century, we have 48, and I put an asterisk there because that's when you actually get the full Bible. That's when the canon was finally agreed upon widely amongst the church. Not that there weren't earlier canons. Do you guys know what I mean when I say canon? Canon is the list of books in the Bible, like the table of contents, the books in our Bible. That's called the canon. Right. So when you hear canon, that's our list of books. Not everyone agreed on it before this time. And so in the 4th century was when they finally had a few councils that put together the canon and said, let's bind all these books of the Bible into one book. So the Bible was actually, all the books in the Bible were actually brought into one book in the 4th century. So you do get entire, full, bound copies of the Bible as far back as the 4th century, which is pretty impressive. The Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are the names of those two full, entire texts we have, and they're our most reliable copies of the ancient Bibles. So is that a lot? So if you think about how many we have, the 5,800 Greek, the 1,900 of other languages, as early as the 2nd century. If you compare that to a different classical Greek writing from that era, you maybe have 10 manuscripts of something else, with maybe an average of being 1,000 years older. Only from about, from maybe the 10th century. That's an average. I've seen charts and breakdowns of this, and I took, about average statistics. Like, for the most part, you're going to have 10 copies of a book from the 1st century, and it's going to be maybe only 1,000 years old. But instead, we have 5,800 copies that are 1,700 years old. So, obviously, the Bible is way more reliable than any other text of that time. Incredibly, incredibly reliable for the time period. It's even supernaturally preserved when you look at these numbers, very much so. Matt Slick of carm.org, that's like an apologetics website, he gives 6 evidences for Christ's resurrection. And so this is going to segue into the next point, so bear with me. If this guy, he basically says, here's how I want to prove Christ was risen from the dead, right? He's going to say, the textual reliability of the ancient documents, so saying what I just went over, like these texts are reliable, they haven't changed over time. The retention of the crucifixion wounds post-event, seeing that we have eyewitnesses that said he had the wounds on his hand. Post-death appearances by many people, he appeared to many, right? Prophetic fulfillment, he fulfilled the prophecies. We went over some of those last class. Accounts written by eyewitnesses, and no counter-historic information. Meaning that there's nothing to say that anything in the gospel is wrong and they got any of their history wrong. Everything historical in the Gospels and New Testament agrees with the secular history that we read about that time and place. So some of these points, though, you have to actually believe that the Gospels are legitimate history records. For example, the appearances to many, the post wounds, the eyewitnesses, and so some of the criticisms you get, for example, an atheist might say, well, we don't even know who wrote the Gospels. You just put names on it. It's like, well, how did we get the names on it, and why do you think we don't know that? There's a reason why we have the names of the authors on the books, even though the books don't have their own names in it. We have applied names to these books and said that these are the authors. So how do we know that? These guys, that's the answer. Eusebius and Papias. I don't know if they look like that. These are just pictures I pulled online. They just have pictures of guys when you Google them, and this just I don't know if this is really them or not, but there's faces to the names, so there you have it. So the Gospels really can be tracked to the 1st century through Papias. So the records we have are from Eusebius, but what happened was Papias, John told Papias who wrote the Gospels, right? So John told Papias, the Apostle John, who wrote a Gospel, told Papias, hey, I wrote a Gospel, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote Gospels, and these are who wrote the Gospels. So Papias is the first-hand source of that information straight from the horse's mouth, John himself. What happened was, but we don't have Papias' writings. He wrote stuff down, but we don't have any copies of Papias' writing. But what happened was Eusebius quoted and referenced Papias' writings, and he has the information that Papias provided the names of the Gospels. So Eusebius has Papias information recorded, and that's how we know the authors of the Gospels. But he has all of them. But the other writers also had the names. Justin Martyr in 120 A.D., Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria around the 90s A.D. These guys also reference some of these authors of the Gospels. So it's not a lone source. It's verified by multiple sources. This is just our best source, has all the names in it. Peter himself likely gave the account for Mark's Gospel, because you think, who's Mark? Matthew was a disciple, John was a disciple, Luke worked with Paul and knew the disciples, but who the heck's Mark? Mark was Peter's buddy. Peter calls Mark in 1 Peter 5:13, calls him a son. So Mark was basically his disciple that he considered, as if he was family. And Mark wrote Peter's account of the gospel. So when you read Mark's gospel, you are reading Peter's account of the gospel. And Mark is generally considered the first gospel because Matthew and Luke copy a lot from Mark and take it into their text. So Peter's account in Mark is possibly our main source of information and kind of the pivotal source of information. So Mark's where it's at. Irenaeus in around 175 says Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were in Rome. And we know when Paul was in Rome, especially through his epistles and stuff, around the early 60s, like 62 to 64 AD was when Peter was in Rome, Peter and Paul. So that would actually place Matthew's gospel to be written in the early 60s AD. So that's kind of a timestamp for when Matthew was written.
Or at least before that.
Well, so what Irenaeus records is it was written while Peter and Paul, Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were in Rome, which we think is 62 to 64. So that would be a time mark for Matthew, and Mark would have been before that. So Mark would have been before the 60s AD. But the dates of the Gospels and when they were written is, up for scrutiny and debate. Any ancient date is usually rough. They didn't have a system of dating their years back then. We actually, Rome actually made that system of having years attached to things much, much later, hundreds of years later, and then they backtrack the years. So the sources vary. Secular scholars' dates for the Gospels would be like Wikipedia says the general consensus of scholars dates Matthew and Luke to be the 80 to 90s AD. Columbia College says between 70 and 110, give or take 5 to 10 years. So really they're saying 60s to 120s AD. And I think that dating an ancient text is difficult, and what they do is they often give like a maximally late date. And these numbers aren't very good, in my opinion. The secular numbers are, well, one thing that really biases them is their disbelief in prophecy. So, Jesus gives a prophecy talking about the temple being destroyed, which happened in 70 AD. So what happens is a secular source will say, well, they were written after 70 AD if he's prophesying of the temple being destroyed. So what they're saying is it couldn't have been written before the temple was destroyed because it prophesied of the temple being destroyed. Because they don't believe that prophecy is real, right? So that influences a lot of these. They'd have to say, well, it was after 70 AD. They just forged and faked and lied about Jesus prophesying about the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being destroyed, right? So, but with us knowing that prophecy is a real thing, we would understand that that is not how it works, right? So, I mean, would it be okay if these are the dates for the Gospels? Like, yeah, I mean, as long as they're written within the apostles' lifetimes, which really takes us, as late as like towards the end of the first century. These dates are fine if this is when they were written, but the evidence really points to them being written quite a bit earlier than this. I mean, like we just said, I mean, we literally have a guy talking about when Matthew was written being in the early 60s AD, which these guys don't even consider really. I mean, this one, maybe you could give that 10 years and get it down to 60, but like, they're not even accounting for what the evidence is saying. So, but again, seculars have their bias. They don't believe in prophecy, so they have to place it after 70. So that's one of the main issues, but there's evidence to show, if Matthew was in the early 60s, Mark was then in the 50s AD, right? And Luke, there's evidence to put Luke pretty early too, especially in that Acts was probably written before 70 AD, or otherwise Luke would have recorded that in his history account, right? And if Acts was written before 70 AD and Luke was written before Acts, then Luke was also before 70 AD. So really, we've now just taken 3 Gospels, placed them in the 50s, 50s and 60s AD with just a small amount of evidence and historical records, and really it's earlier than all the secular sources say. So that tells you their biases, that they just don't believe in prophecy, so they're going to put it much later. That's really what it comes down to. You have Acts. Right in the intro of Acts, sources will say anywhere between 60 and 150, but, likely before 70 AD. So I'd say in the 60s AD this was done, while Luke was touring with Paul on the missionary trips and whatnot. He ran into a lot of the apostles, got a lot of their accounts. We know that, Paul and Peter spent time together. We know that Luke spent time with these guys, met a lot of the apostles, interviewed them. Luke claims to have gotten his gospel from eyewitnesses, being Peter. He took a lot from Mark's account, so he considers Mark's gospel an eyewitness account directly from Peter. And Luke also interviewed other people. Luke has the most detailed gospel, so obviously he interviewed people to get some of those details. So right in the beginning of Acts, you see the first account I comprised, Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up to heaven after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles who he had chosen. And so on. So he says, I have a first account, Theophilus. And right in the intro to Luke, his gospel, he has the same kind of introduction to Theophilus. And if you analyze, there are experts who can analyze text, these textual critics, and they say Luke and Acts are from the same author. They use the same sentence structure. They use the same Greek words. They have the same set of vocabulary and syntax and structural sentence structure, paragraph structures, so on. I mean, they didn't have paragraphs back then, but the way the ideas string together. Luke and Acts were from the same author. And obviously, here in Acts, you're saying, well, this is his second writing, so the first one was Luke's gospel. So if placing this before 70 AD, you definitely get Luke before 70 AD. So it just gets us a nice placement for an idea of when these things were written and how they were written. Let's move on to Paul. This is an interesting bit. Paul quotes Luke as known scripture. And 1 Timothy generally dates to about 65 AD. Paul's writings were from the 50s to 60s ADs in general. And Jesus died about 30 AD. So you're talking just 30 years after Jesus died. This is very early. And secular historians don't argue with Paul's dates. Do you know why? Because he didn't have prophecies that made them argue with it. So they didn't have any, and he also didn't have a bunch of miracles listed in his epistles, right? Because they're just letters to churches. So secular scholars don't have any reason to disbelieve Paul's writing, because there's nothing that they consider unbelievable. So when we say, Paul's writings are from the 50s to 60s AD, everybody unanimously agrees on this, without argument. I've never seen even an atheist historian argue that Paul's writings are from the 50s to 60s AD. I've seen them argue that some of Paul's writings may not have been from Paul, but they agree on at least a handful of them having been from Paul. Not that there's any reason for argument, but what I'm saying is, no, this is all agreed upon. So again, it's agreed because there's no biases. There's no reason to bias Paul. There's no miracles. There's no prophecies. So everyone just says, yeah, this seems believable.
I think they also all agree because of something happened in his life where he had a radical conversion from one thought process to another.
Yeah.
So that's another.
And he records that testimony in multiple epistles too, which those are the ones that they all say, yeah, I guess this is all the same writer, right? But it's like, if it didn't have that testimony, then they just say, well, I don't believe it, which is silly. But yeah, argument from absence isn't an absence of argument. Is that how it goes? Did I say that right? Something like that. So And interestingly, in 1 Timothy 5:18, he says, "For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages." So he's quoting here in this underlined part, Luke 10:7, which is Jesus. He's quoting Jesus here. Word for word, the same Greek sentence that appears in Luke, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. That's not from the Hebrew, it's not from the Old Testament. He's quoting Luke directly there. So with Acts being before 70 and Luke before Acts, this places Luke's Gospels in the early 60s AD or earlier, because it's, again, he's writing this in 65 AD. That means the Gospel of Luke was already around, which is pretty cool. You literally have Paul quoting a Gospel, which shouldn't surprise us, but this is the only time we actually see this happen, where Paul quotes a Gospel directly. The only time. Which is, it's great that it's there, but it's interesting that he doesn't have more. He paraphrases what Paul does. There's many paraphrases of the Gospels that Paul uses, but word for word quotes, this would be the only one. And probably because this is from Luke. He probably had Luke's account most handy because he toured with Luke. He was on missionary trips living with Luke. So it makes sense that he's going to quote Luke. Right? And we know that Paul met Timothy likely in Lystra. We see that in Acts 16. So we have witnesses also to Paul's relationship with Timothy through Luke. So we have Luke connecting Paul and Timothy together, and Paul's writing Timothy here. So you have kind of a nice circle of friends who all verify what we're all talking about. They're all on the same page, right? Matt Slick, that guy we just read with those 6 points, says textual criticism shows us that Luke scribed 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So, for example, when I said sometimes people debate who wrote some of Paul's epistles, and atheists will say, look, this has a different writer than Paul. This guy used different vocabulary than Paul did. Well, the textual criticism actually shows that the guy who wrote Luke and Acts also wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So what happened was, while Paul was touring with Luke, going on missions, spending time together, they were working together, Luke wrote these for Paul. He was Paul's scribe. And what we know about scribes is that they sometimes put things in their own words. Paul would say, I want to say this, and Luke would maybe clarify it a little bit. So we know that we got some Luke-isms in these. When I say Luke-isms, I mean his personal flair, his personal vocabulary. He might have taken Paul's vocabulary and used more clear words and thought, you know what, I'm going to take what he said and use this word instead because this word clarifies what he was trying to say. And they would have probably had back and forth discussion. Well, you're trying to say it that way, but what if I say it this way? Is that more what you're trying to say? So they'd have some discussion. So in other words, Paul and Luke wrote these epistles together. And we have guys who are expert textual analysts who can show us that these were written by Luke, which is pretty amazing. And it doesn't surprise me, that they'd sit down and write letters to churches together. I mean, it's like a minister it's like Stephen taking his assistant and saying, "Hey, let's write a letter to let's write a letter to our pastors over in Putnam, and let's review what we want to say." It's not going to sound all like Stephen's stuff because his assistant is going to put their information and their words in there too. So you get Luke-isms in Paul's epistles here. But it also shows us that these were written in that first century. This is Luke's writing. We know who they're from, and we know that means we get a time, place, and date to them also, which brings a lot of credibility to the text. And then it also explains why Paul quoted Luke word for word. Luke quoted himself word for word is what happened. Luke quoted himself. Well, he quoted Jesus. He quoted his quote of Jesus, right? Jesus said that, Luke recorded it. So Luke put that in there. Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. So this places Luke's gospel before 55 AD, being 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. I have 65 AD here, but Matt Slick said there's evidence to put these in 55 AD. So Matt Slick's saying Luke must have been before 55 AD. That's a very early date for Luke's gospel. And Matt Slick's pretty solid. I like his stuff. So he has he has good information, stuff like this. I never find this information from anyone else. Like this guy, his website's amazing. Very carm.org, apologetic stuff. Amazing website. I spent a lot of hours on this website as a new Christian, digging through this stuff. But Paul also paraphrases gospel teachings elsewhere. This isn't the only time he quotes the gospel. It's the only time you get a quote word for word. And that's because Luke wrote it. So he word for word quoted what he had written in his gospel. But you get paraphrases in Paul's, so these are what we know Paul wrote. In Romans 2, he's quoting Matthew and John. In Romans 3, he's quoting John and Matthew again. So Romans 2 and 3, he is quoting the Gospels. Not word for word, but I believe these are, all the law is, fulfilled in love your neighbor as yourself. Paul is paraphrasing that idea directly from the Gospels. And it's not quite word for word from the Gospel, but it's very close to word for word from what these Gospels say. So this is Paul's genuine writing. Romans is Paul's genuine writing. And so he's paraphrasing from the Gospels. So he is drawing from the Gospels. So we know the Gospels were around before. There's one other theory that exists, something called the Q source, which was that maybe there was an early set of notes that they were using that isn't in the gospel form we have today, but was like an earlier set of texts from that time. So again, these dates are all kind of rough, so take them with a grain of salt. So this is the Q source idea. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the synoptic gospels. You know why they're called synoptic? Anyone know? Why are they called synoptic? Yeah, they're copied from one another. They're similar. Synoptic, like the word synonym. A synonym being two words that mean the same thing. They're very similar. So Matthew and Luke both borrow from Mark. And you'd say, how do you know that? Well, Mark has the writing, and Matthew and Luke have the same writing. Therefore, you'd say, they must have drawn from Mark. But Matthew and Luke share material that isn't in Mark. So you have Mark, then you have Matthew and Luke drawing from Mark, but Matthew and Luke also have material that's shared that isn't from Mark. So where'd they get the shared material? I mean, you could say, well, one copied from the other. Maybe Luke copied from Matthew, or maybe Matthew copied some information over from Luke, so they may have shared directly. But the other theory is that there's a Q source, a questionable source that we don't have today, an early set of notes that they were drawing from. So basically a fifth gospel was possibly out there before. We may have had 5 gospels at one point, is the point. We may have had 5 gospels and we may have lost one. So that's basically the idea of the Q source, that there could have been a 5th book out there that Matthew and Luke both drew from. So they either copied from each other or copied from a 5th gospel. So yeah, the logical deduction is they may have had another 5th gospel. It's just a theory, but they could have borrowed from one another also. So there's questions as to how did that play out, But either way, it again just brings reliability to the text.